In the earliest communities, sacred writings arrived as single scrolls or single letters. One group received a text, read it, and treated it as a shared treasure. Then the obvious problem appeared. A message meant to guide many people existed in only one place at a time. If another community needed it, the original had to travel, and the first community lost access. Sharing scripture widely demanded a new step. Copies had to be made. At first, copying sounded simple. One person read, another wrote, and the words moved from one sheet to the next. But each duplicate changed the situation. A community no longer depended on a visitor carrying the only copy. They could keep the text, teach from it, and send another version onward. The writings started to spread because they could multiply. Yet every new copy also created a quiet risk. The text depended on human hands. This early copying did not begin as a distant, organized industry. It started as a practical response to demand. More readers meant more manuscripts, and more manuscripts meant more opportunities for small differences to appear. A word could be missed, a phrase repeated, a line written slightly differently. The communities still believed they preserved the same message. But from the beginning, the Bible's reach grew through copying, and copying carried consequences. As demand grew, copying stopped being an occasional favor and became a job. Professional scribes appeared, trained to write fast and clearly, and some communities organized early copying rooms to produce multiple manuscripts. But speed had a cost. One person read from a master copy while another wrote, and every step depended on steady attention. The work promised consistency, yet it also multiplied the chances for tiny errors to slip in. The materials shaped what happened next. Papyrus sheets and parchment skins behaved differently, and neither forgave hesitation. Ink needed the right thickness. Pens needed constant trimming, and letters had to stay even across long lines. When a hand paused, a stroke changed. When ink ran thin, a mark faded. A scribe might misspell a common word, swap two similar-looking letters, or accidentally repeat a phrase already written. Then fatigue took over, because copying meant hours of the same motions under pressure to keep going. Eyes drifted, hands cramped, and the most common mistake had a simple cause. The eye jumped. If two lines ended with similar words, a scribe sometimes skipped from the first ending to the second and left out everything between. These were not dramatic changes. They were ordinary human slips, and they were unavoidable. As handwritten copies traveled, they did not spread evenly. One town received a few pages early, another got a different bundle later, and many places got nothing for years. Each community treated what it had as the reference point. When a new copy was needed, scribes usually copied the local manuscript on hand. That simple habit did something powerful. It made small local quirks repeat, then settle in. Over time, those repeating quirks began to cluster. A dropped word that slipped in once got copied again and again in one region. A spelling preference became the normal spelling there. A line order that happened to survive in one chain stayed that way because every new copy came from the last one. The text did not drift randomly everywhere at once. It split into streams, and each stream carried its own pattern. That was how text families formed. Not because anyone announced a new edition, but because distance and routine did the work. A church in one area kept reproducing its familiar wording, while another community, far away, kept reproducing a slightly different one. When later readers compared manuscripts from different regions, they did not just see isolated mistakes. They saw relatives. Groups of copies that resembled each other, generation after generation. As manuscripts traveled, a new kind of change appeared. Some scribes stopped acting like simple copy machines and started acting like editors. They read a line and felt a snag. The wording sounded rough, or the meaning seemed unclear, or it differed from a familiar version they already knew, so they adjusted it as they copied. It still looked like the same text, but it no longer matched the older wording exactly. One common move involved parallel passages. When two books told the same event with small differences, a scribe sometimes fixed the mismatch. A detail from one version slipped into the other. Another change seemed harmless. Grammar got smoothed, an awkward phrase got tidied, a confusing pronoun got replaced with a name. Each step made the sentence easier to read. Yet every improvement pushed the copy one notch farther from its source. The most sensitive corrections touched theology. If a line sounded like it could be misunderstood, a scribe sometimes clarified it. A title for God became more explicit. A statement about Jesus became less open to doubt. These were not random slips from tired eyes. They were choices made with good intentions, and they spread when later scribes trusted the cleaner version. From this point on, variation came from accidents and from deliberate repair. By late antiquity, Christianity spread with more stability, and the way its writings travelled changed. Scrolls still existed, but the codex, pages bound together like a modern book, became the standard. That shift sounded simple, but it reshaped copying. A scribe no longer followed one long roll. Now the text came in openings, page by page, and the physical order suddenly mattered. With that new format came new failure points. Pages could be misplaced during copying, then copied in the wrong sequence without anyone noticing until much later. Whole sections sometimes switched places. A scribe might end one page with a familiar phrase, then restart on a different page that ended the same way. The result looked smooth. The mistake stayed hidden inside the book. The codex also invited constant side comments. Readers and scribes wrote quick notes in the margins to explain a hard line, offer an alternate wording, or flag a problem. Later copyists met those notes and faced a choice they did not always recognize as a choice. A comment could slip into the body text, copied as if it belonged there, and once it entered, it multiplied. In the medieval period, copying moved into monasteries and became a routine job with rules. Instead of one tired scribe working alone, scriptoria organized the work. They aimed for consistency in spelling, layout, and wording. More eyes checked the text. Corrections happened before mistakes spread. The result sounded simple. Fewer new errors entered the stream, and copies began to look more alike. Proofreading mattered because a single slip could multiply for generations. Monastic teams compared a fresh copy against an older one and marked problems fast. They also standardized small things like common abbreviations and familiar phrasing, so future scribes followed the same habits. That discipline trimmed down random variation, but it also created a new effect. The copy that served as the model quietly became the master. That master copy carried its own history. If it came from one region, it kept that region's older readings, even after the wider world changed. Monasteries copied what they owned year after year, sometimes for centuries, forming long copying chains that stayed remarkably stable. Standardization reduced noise, but it did not erase the past. It preserved it, locking earlier local versions into durable medieval lines. Over time, something shifted. Copying still mattered, but so did comparison. Scholars stopped treating one manuscript as the best, simply because it looked neat or read smoothly. They placed different copies side by side and noticed patterns. The same verse ran longer in one place, shorter in another, or swapped words in a way that changed the meaning. The goal became clearer. Recovering earlier wording meant asking harder questions. They began compiling critical notes, lists of places where manuscripts disagreed. Instead of hiding differences, they recorded them. A spelling change might not matter, but a missing line did. A polished phrase might actually sounded like a later improvement. Each variation forced a decision, and each decision needed reasons. Age of the manuscript mattered, but so did geography, the habits of scribes, and whether a reading explained the others. This approach changed the entire problem. The text no longer depended on trusting a single copy, even a respected one. It depended on weighing evidence, like a judge listening to multiple witnesses. When several independent manuscripts agreed, that carried weight. When one stood alone, it raised suspicion. Critical notes grew into a tool scholars relied on because they showed the work behind the wording and admitted uncertainty when the evidence stayed split. Then a machine changed the whole pace of scripture. In the mid-1400s, Johannes Gutenberg put movable metal type to work, and a Bible no longer needed to be copied line by hand. One setting of type could produce hundreds of near-identical pages. That repetition created something new: stability. A community could buy the same text again and again, and it stayed the same across a whole region. But printing did not start from a perfect master copy. Printers had to choose which manuscripts to set in type, and those manuscripts already carried their own history of edits and limits. Once the choice got printed, it gained authority simply because it got repeated. A reading that had been one option among many now looked like the standard. The press did not erase variation, it selected it. Early printed editions also froze earlier decisions made under pressure. Editors sometimes worked from a small stack of manuscripts or from ones that lacked certain parts, and they filled gaps as best they could. Misreadings, rushed judgments, even small guesses could now travel farther than any scribe could manage. And because print felt final, later readers trusted it more, even when the evidence had been thin. In the modern era, the game changed because the evidence multiplied. Archaeologists uncovered early Christian papyri in the sands of Egypt. Small, fragile scraps, but often far older than the copies people had relied on. Alongside them stood the great parchment codices, massive books that carried large sections of the Bible. Suddenly, scholars no longer worked from a handful of late manuscripts. They faced a flood of earlier witnesses. That flood demanded new tools. Manuscripts got catalogued, numbered, and described so researchers could track exactly what each copy contained and how it related to others. Photographs and careful transcriptions let readings travel without moving the originals. Scholars compared spelling habits, copying patterns, and shared mistakes to map lines of descent. The result was not one dramatic, perfect find, but a clearer, wider picture of where variants came from. With more data came a new kind of honesty in translation. Committees weighed the evidence and sometimes chose a reading that differed from familiar printed forms, not to rewrite scripture, but to follow the earliest and strongest witnesses, and they showed their work. Footnotes began to report alternate wordings and missing or added phrases, explaining why a choice got made. Variants stopped being rumours. They became documented options. By the time modern translation teams worked, the Bible no longer depended on one fragile chain of local copies. They gathered thousands of witnesses, Greek manuscripts, ancient translations, and quotations in early Christian writing. Each witness carried its own mix of careful copying and human slip-ups. The scale changed everything. Instead of guessing what happened in the past from a single page, scholars lined up whole crowds of pages and watched patterns emerge. That comparison produced something older scribes never had, a map of variation. For many passages, the differences stayed small, but they still mattered because they showed where copying habits pulled the text in different directions. Editors weighed the evidence, not by instinct, but by tracing which readings appeared earlier, which spread wider, and which explained the rise of the others. The goal was not a perfect manuscript, it was the best supported wording. Then modern translations carried that process into plain view. Committees debated wording, checked it against the data, and left a trail readers could follow in footnotes and critical apparatuses. When a sentence existed in two forms, the options sat openly on the page instead of being quietly absorbed. This finished the long arc. What began as vulnerable hand-copied sharing ended as documented comparison. Variation no longer hid in the shadows. It got measured.